Mrs. Green had lived her entire life in the small, quiet town of Maplewood. A woman of more than 70 years. She was no stranger to hardship. Her hands, rough and worn from decades of work, carried the weight of a life spent in struggle. For as long as she could remember, she had been selling vegetables at the town's humble market, a market that, much like her life, was full of quiet persistence and unnoticed effort. Each day, she arrived before the sun had fully risen, setting up her stall in a corner where the shade of an old oak tree provided her with a bit of relief from the scorching heat in summer, and shelter from the biting cold in winter. Mrs. Green's vegetables were often not the most beautiful or fresh. They were usually the leftover produce from the farms that couldn't be sold anywhere else: wilted lettuce, overripe tomatoes, bruised apples, and carrots that had seen better days. But to her, these vegetables were more than just food. They were the last remnants of a life she could never seem to escape. Every morning, as she arranged her produce on the wooden table, she would think of her late husband, Henry, who had passed away more than 10 years ago. He had been a quiet man, full of stories from the past, and they had lived their lives together, dreaming of a time when they could finally rest. But fate had different plans. After his passing, life became a constant battle for Mrs. Green. Her son, Peter, had been taken from her in a tragic accident shortly after his father's death, leaving her to raise her only grandchild, Alex, who was still a boy at the time. Alex, now a young man in university, was the reason Mrs. Green kept going. She didn't have much, just her small stall and the meager income it provided, but it was enough to ensure Alex could attend school. With the rising costs of education, Mrs. Green found herself working harder than ever, waking up early and staying at the market well into the evening, just to make enough to pay for Alex's textbooks, tuition fees, and meals. She had grown used to the quiet, indifferent faces of the people who passed by her stall. They would glance at the wilted vegetables, often with a sneer, and then move on to the fresh, perfect produce of the other vendors. No one ever stopped. No one ever cared. It was as though she and her vegetables were invisible, just another forgotten corner of the market, blending into the grey backdrop of life. Still, Mrs. Green kept her head high and her smile steady. She had learned long ago that it was not the things she lacked that defined her, but the things she gave. And so, every day, she sold her produce with the same kindness, the same gentle smile, despite the isolation she felt. Her grandson, Alex, visited her whenever he could, but he was always busy with his studies. She often wondered if he truly understood the sacrifices she made. Sometimes, in the quiet of the early morning, as she prepared her vegetables for the day, she would think about how much longer she could keep this up. But for Alex, she would do anything. Her love for him was the one thing that had never wavered, the one thing that kept her going even when she felt like her own heart was slowly giving out. But as the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, Mrs. Green's body began to feel the strain. She had always been a strong woman, but now her joints ached, her back hurt, and her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the vegetables. She didn't complain. After all, there was no one to listen. But in the silence of the cold mornings, when the market was still and empty, she couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could keep it up. One particularly cold morning, as Mrs. Green was unpacking her stall, a man in a well-tailored coat approached her. His appearance was striking, a sharp contrast to the worn, weathered market around him. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, and his presence seemed almost out of place in the quiet of the market. Mrs. Green, accustomed to the dull, everyday crowd, barely looked up as he approached. But then, to her surprise, the man spoke. "I'll take all your vegetables," he said in a smooth, polite voice. Mrs. Green blinked, her hands pausing in mid-motion. "All of them?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. She had heard many strange requests in her years at the market, But none quite like this. The man smiled, his eyes twinkling with an odd kindness. Yes. All of them. I'll pay you for the full price. Of course. He handed her a stack of bills that was much more than the vegetables were worth. Mrs. Green stood there, momentarily stunned, staring at the money in her hands. It was more than enough to cover the cost of Alex's next semester at university. More than she could have ever imagined earning in a single day. But something about the man's offer didn't sit right with her. She had never been one to accept charity, and the idea of someone buying her vegetables at such an inflated price seemed off. Why would you want all of them? She asked, her voice hesitant. They're not much. Just old vegetables no one else wanted. The man gave a soft chuckle. That's exactly why I want them, he said. You'd be surprised at how much value lies in things that seem unimportant. The true worth of something is often hidden beneath the surface. Your vegetables, despite their appearance, are valuable to someone who truly understands their worth. His words left Mrs. Green puzzled, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. But in the end, she accepted the money. He bought all her produce that day and promised to return the next. For the next 2 weeks, Mr. Harris returned every day, buying all of Mrs. Green's vegetables without fail. Each time, he paid her far more than they were worth. Each time, Mrs. Green became more and more confused. Why was this man buying her old, withered vegetables? What was he doing with them? She couldn't help but wonder. What was the true worth of her life? Her work? Could there be something more to her humble stall than she had ever imagined? But that was a question for another day. Today, she simply had to keep going for Alex. For the future. For love. As the days passed, Mrs. Green couldn't shake the mystery of Mr. Harris. Each morning, he would appear at her stall without fail, looking as composed and dignified as the day before. He bought every last one of her vegetables. The wilting lettuce, the overripe tomatoes, and the bruised apples, items no one else wanted. And every time, he paid her more than she could have imagined. At first, Mrs. Green had been hesitant. She'd never accepted charity, and this stranger's repeated generosity made her uneasy. Yet, she couldn't ignore the kindness in his eyes, the softness in his voice. There was something about him, something unspoken that tugged at her. She wasn't sure whether to be grateful or suspicious. Maybe he was just trying to make her feel better about her life, giving her money out of pity for the poor old woman selling faded produce. But after 2 weeks of his strange routine, Mrs. Green began to wonder, why was he buying all her vegetables? What was he doing with them? She had to know. So, one crisp morning, as Mr. Harris approached her stall, she decided to ask. Her voice, though gentle, carried a tone of curiosity and suspicion that was hard to hide. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her hands still trembling as she arranged some of the wilting lettuce. "I must ask, why are you buying my vegetables every day? They're not fresh. Most people wouldn't even consider buying them." Mr. Harris paused for a moment, as if taken aback by the question. He studied her face intently, his eyes warm and thoughtful. Then, with a calm smile, he spoke. "Because your vegetables are more valuable than you think. Mrs. Green," he said softly, "what most people overlook or discard, I see as something more, something that can be turned into something meaningful." Mrs. Green frowned. "Meaningful," she repeated. "These vegetables are nothing more than old scraps. They can't be used for anything worthwhile." Mr. Harris shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed on hers. "You'd be surprised. There is value in everything. Even things that seem discarded or unwanted. The worth isn't always in the way something looks, it's in what it can become, what it can contribute." Mrs. Green was silent for a moment, still processing his words. What could he possibly mean? She wasn't a fool, she had lived long enough to know the value of hard work and honesty. But this idea of seeing value in things that appeared worthless was foreign to her. It felt like a riddle she couldn't solve. Before she could speak again, Mr. Harris added, "You'll see soon enough. Mrs. Green, there's something I want to show you. Something I think you'll understand better once you see it for yourself." The offer of seeing something intrigued her. But she was still wary. He had been kind. Yes. But there was something about him that was just a little too polished. Too perfect. Mrs. Green had lived through many years of hardship. And she had learned to trust her instincts. Especially when it came to strangers. Yet, something about Mr. Harris made her feel like he was not someone to fear. But someone whose intentions were worth exploring. "I'll come with you," she said at last. Surprising even herself. "But only because I need to know what you mean by all this." Mr. Harris smiled. A glimmer of approval in his eyes. He gestured for her to follow him. And they left the market together. As they walked through the quiet streets of Maplewood, Mrs. Green couldn't help but wonder what she had just agreed to. What was it about this man that had drawn her in? She had no idea. But she knew this wasn't just about buying vegetables anymore. Something deeper was at play. Something that could change everything. Little did she know. This journey would be the beginning of a discovery that would forever alter her understanding of life. Of love. And of her own worth. As they walked through the quiet streets of Maplewood, Mrs. Green couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and skepticism. She had no idea where Mr. Harris was taking her. But there was something compelling about his calm demeanor. His kindness had been unlike anything she had experienced in years. Despite her many years of hardship, she had never met anyone quite like him, someone who saw value in things others had overlooked. Mr. Harris led her to a large, old building on the edge of town that Mrs. Green had passed by many times but never thought much about. It was a simple, yet solid structure, with ivy creeping up its walls and windows that had seen better days. A faded sign above the door read, "Hope House, Shelter for the Elderly and Needy." "Here," Mr. Harris said, gesturing toward the building. "This is where your vegetables are going." Mrs. Green stood for a moment, staring at the sign. The building didn't look like much from the outside. But there was something about it that made her heart tighten in her chest. She had always believed that the true measure of a person's worth wasn't in the things they owned or the appearance of their surroundings, but in the good they did for others. And now, she was beginning to see that perhaps Mr. Harris's actions were rooted in something much deeper than just buying her produce. He led her through the doors of the shelter, where the scent of cooking food filled the air. Inside, a group of elderly men and women sat at long wooden tables, talking quietly to each other, while children played in the corner, their laughter echoing through the room. The sight of the children, their faces bright and hopeful despite their obvious poverty, made Mrs. Green's heart swell. This was a place of warmth, of love, and of care. But what did her vegetables have to do with all of this? Mr. Harris guided her to the kitchen, where a group of volunteers were preparing meals. He walked up to a large pot on the stove, where a woman was stirring a soup that smelled rich and hearty. Mrs. Green's eyes widened when she saw the contents of the pot. It was filled with the very vegetables she had sold him, her wilting lettuce, her overripe tomatoes, and bruised carrots. "These vegetables," Mr. Harris said, "are what will feed these people. What you might think of as leftovers, I see as an opportunity to nourish. Your vegetables may not be perfect, but they are filled with life, with the care you put into your work. That is why I buy them." Mrs. Green stood there, speechless, watching as the soup was ladled into bowls and served to the elderly residents and children. The sight of the humble vegetables, transformed into something nourishing and life-sustaining, moved her deeply. She had never thought of her vegetables in that way. To her, they had always been just old scraps, unworthy of attention. But now, she could see the truth in Mr. Harris's words. Her vegetables were not just food, they were a symbol of her own perseverance, her hard work, and her love for her grandson. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized that her efforts, small and unnoticed as they had seemed, were making a difference in the lives of those who had nothing. She had spent so many years wondering if her life had any meaning beyond the daily grind, beyond the struggle to make ends meet. But here, in this humble shelter, she saw that even the smallest of acts could have profound consequences. The love and care she put into her work had found a place to thrive, a place where it was needed the most. Mr. Harris, noticing the tears in her eyes, smiled softly. "You see, Mrs. Green, the value of your vegetables, of your work, is not in their outward appearance. It is in what they become when they are shared with others. It is in the lives they touch, the nourishment they provide." For the first time in years, Mrs. Green felt a deep sense of peace. Her life, though filled with pain and loss, had been full of meaning all along. She had not realized it, but her small actions, her quiet contributions, had been a lifeline for others, just as they had been for Alex. She had always believed that she was just a small part of a much larger world. But now she understood that even the smallest pieces of the puzzle had their place. As she left the shelter that day, Mrs. Green's heart was full. She had learned a lesson that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. It wasn't the size of the gesture that mattered, but the love and care behind it. And with that understanding, she knew that her life, though hard, had always been valuable. When she returned to her stall the next day, Mrs. Green stood a little taller, her smile a little brighter. The vegetables she sold were still the same, but the way she saw them had changed. They were no longer just old scraps, they were treasures. Small gifts of love and resilience, ready to nourish the world. As the days went by, Mrs. Green found herself returning to the market with a renewed sense of purpose. She no longer saw the vegetables she sold as remnants of a life that had passed its prime, they had become symbols of something greater. In the quiet hum of her daily routine, she could still hear Mr. Harris's words echoing in her mind. It's not the way something looks that matters. It's what it can become, what it can contribute. It was a message that resonated deeply with her, one that she had never quite understood until now. For the first time in years, Mrs. Green saw herself not just as an old woman struggling to make ends meet, but as someone who could make a real difference. Her life, though filled with hardship, had always been meaningful. Even if she hadn't recognized it, she had, in her own small way, been contributing to the world around her, nourishing those in need. And that, she realized, was enough. Her grandson, Alex, too, began to understand the value of his grandmother's work. He had always been too focused on his studies, too concerned with the pressures of school, to appreciate the quiet sacrifices she made for him. But seeing the change in her, the way she carried herself with a new sense of dignity, made him look at her in a different light. He began to realize that true success wasn't just about grades or money, it was about the quiet acts of love and care that went unnoticed. The sacrifices made for others without expecting anything in return. He learned that life was not just about the achievements that could be seen, but about the quiet contributions that often went unseen, yet were just as important. As for Mr. Harris, he had always known the power of giving, of seeing the potential in things that others overlooked. His act of kindness had been a catalyst for change, not just for Mrs. Green, but for everyone who had come into contact with the vegetables she sold. It was a simple lesson, but one that had profound implications. What we give, no matter how small, has the power to transform lives. Mr. Harris knew that the vegetables would never be the same again. They had served a purpose beyond mere sustenance. They had been transformed into something meaningful, something that nourished both body and soul. His role in that transformation was small, but he took comfort in the knowledge that it had made a difference. His lesson was clear: sometimes, it is the smallest gestures that have the greatest impact, and the simplest acts of kindness can change the course of someone's life. As for Mrs. Green, she had learned something profound. Her life, though marked by loss and hardship, had always been valuable. The work she did, no matter how insignificant it seemed, had meaning. She had spent so many years questioning her place in the world, wondering if her struggles had any purpose at all. But now, she understood, it's not the size of the gesture that matters, it's the heart behind it. When Mrs. Green looked at her vegetables now, she no longer saw them as a reflection of her own poverty or decline. She saw them as a symbol of her perseverance, her dedication to her family, and her contribution to the community. Every carrot, every wilted leaf, every bruised apple had been a part of something bigger, something that mattered. And in that realization, she found peace. As for Alex, he had learned a lesson about love and sacrifice. He saw his grandmother in a new light, not as just a caretaker but as a woman who had given everything she had to make sure he had a future. His grandmother's work, though humble, was a reminder that true success was not just measured by wealth or fame, but by the kindness we extend to others. True wealth, he realized, lies in how much we give, not in what we keep. And Mr. Harris, with his quiet wisdom, had reminded them both of something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives: no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. In the end, the lesson was simple yet profound: what you give will come back to you in ways you can't always see. But it will always matter.